Let's talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
CGTN's Beatrice Marshall looks at how China's Belt and Road Initiative is helping shape and advance Africa's development priorities.
Musa Azan Zungu, the Deputy Speaker of Tanzania's National Assembly, said the China proposed Belt and Road Initiative has been another milestone in the China-Africa partnership that complements the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
In the Rift Valley of Kenya, about 300 kilometers from the Ugandan border, a brand new railway ends in a cornfield. The tracks just stop. The standard gauge railway was supposed to stretch from the port of Mombasa all the way through to Uganda and eventually link 6 countries together. It cost around $4.5 billion. China's Export-Import Bank paid for most of it. But when Kenya asked for more money to finish the line, Beijing said no. That railway, sitting unfinished, tells you something important about what is happening across the continent right now. For 2 decades, Chinese money poured into Africa. New roads, new ports, new power plants, new rail lines. At the peak in 2016, Chinese lenders sent about $28 billion to African governments in a single year. That is a staggering amount. But by 2022, that number had dropped to less than $1 billion. In 2024, it fell again to just over $2 billion spread across only 6 projects in 5 countries. The giant flow of Chinese infrastructure money to Africa did not just slow down, it collapsed. And that collapse has left a question hanging over everything. When the biggest builder in the room walks away, who keeps building? That question matters because Africa's need for infrastructure is enormous. Nearly 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa still have no connection to an electrical grid. That is more than 2/3 of everyone on Earth who lives without power. Only about half of Africa's rural population can reach an all-weather road. Rail networks across the continent are about 1/10 as dense as the global average, and the lack of clean water and basic sanitation alone costs Africa an estimated 5% of its total economic output every year. The World Bank estimates that sub-Saharan Africa needs to spend about 7% of its total income every year just to close this gap. Right now, spending sits at roughly half that level. The African Development Bank has put a number on it. Africa needs somewhere between $130 billion and $170 billion a year in infrastructure investment. The shortfall, the gap between what is spent and what is needed, runs into the tens of billions. When China's money was flowing freely, it helped fill a real part of that gap. Chinese firms built airports and highways and dams in dozens of countries. They built things that other lenders often would not touch. Big, messy, expensive projects in places where traditional banks saw too much risk. So when that money dried up, it left behind something more than unfinished railways. It left a financing hole that no single country or institution can easily fill. To understand why the money stopped, you have to look at what happened when it was flowing. Some of the projects worked well. New roads cut travel times, new ports moved more goods, but others turned into cautionary tales. Kenya's standard gauge railway is one of the most studied examples. The railway opened in 2017 and passengers love it. The ride from Mombasa to Nairobi, which used to take all day by bus, now takes about 5 hours by train. But the railway was supposed to pay for itself by carrying cargo. A Chinese feasibility study predicted it would move 22 million tons of freight per year. In reality, it carries far less. Shipping by train costs more than shipping by truck in Kenya, partly because of the added cost of getting goods to and from the rail stations. The railway's income in 2022 was around $84 million. Kenya's annual loan repayments to China for the project are roughly $1 billion. Kenya's total debt to China now sits at roughly $6 billion. The railway loan pushed Kenya's national debt from about 38% of its economic output in 2012 to nearly 70%. That debt absorbs money that could go to hospitals, schools, and security. Kenya is not alone. Zambia borrowed billions from Chinese institutions to build roads and power stations and airports. By 2020, over half of the country's tax income was going straight to debt payments. In November of that year, Zambia defaulted. It became the first African country to fail on its debt payments during the pandemic era. The restructuring talks that followed dragged on for over 3 years. partly because Chinese lenders resisted the kinds of debt forgiveness that Western creditors traditionally accept. Djibouti, a tiny nation on the Horn of Africa, owes China about $1.5 billion, equal to roughly 45% of its entire economy. In January 2023, Djibouti stopped making payments to China altogether. These stories rippled back to Beijing. Chinese leaders saw the political backlash. They heard the phrase, debt trap, repeated in Western media and in African parliaments. They also faced real financial risks at home, including a property bubble and a slowing economy. So Chinese policy banks pulled back. They began favoring what President Xi Jinping called small and beautiful projects, smaller loans, shorter terms, and fewer massive construction deals. Into this gap stepped a familiar group of institutions. The World Bank, the African Development Bank, and bilateral Western donors increased their commitments to Africa. During the years when Chinese lending fell sharply, World Bank lending to Africa rose from about $52 billion a year in 2016 to $90 billion a year by 2021. But this money comes with strings. Traditional development lenders require detailed environmental reviews, social impact studies, competitive bidding, and governance conditions. These safeguards exist for good reason. They protect communities and reduce corruption. But they also slow everything down. A project that might take 2 years to approve and fund through the World Bank could have started within months under a Chinese bilateral loan. There is another problem. A shortage of bankable projects. The World Bank has found that 80% of infrastructure projects in Africa fail at the feasibility and business planning stage. There is no shortage of need, no shortage of money willing to be invested, but a huge shortage of projects that have been properly studied, planned, and structured so that lenders feel safe putting money in. China's approach had sometimes bypassed this bottleneck, but often at the cost of projects like the Kenya Railway, where the economics were shaky from the start. So while Western institutions are lending more, the pace is not fast enough to replace what China used to provide. The gap has narrowed, but for many projects already in motion, roads half paved, bridges half built, power stations waiting for final funding, the wait continues. Something unexpected has begun to change the picture. Sovereign wealth funds from the Persian Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have started investing in African infrastructure in a serious way. This is a newer story and it is moving fast. According to the Arab Coordination Group, Gulf development money to Africa tops $60 billion over the past decade. But the pace has accelerated sharply in recent years. Between 2022 and 2022 alone, Gulf states invested roughly $113 billion in foreign direct investment across Africa. The UAE has become one of the top 5 investors on the continent, and trade between the UAE and Africa surged by 30% in 2024, reaching $100 billion. Where exactly is this money going? Ports and logistics corridors mostly. Dubai-based DP World, one of the largest port operators in the world, has announced plans to invest $3 billion in African port and logistics infrastructure by 2029. In Tanzania, DP World signed a 30-year deal to operate key berths at the port of Dar es Salaam. The initial investment was $250 million, with plans to reach $1 billion over the life of the agreement. The results have been quick. Within 5 months of DP World taking over operations at Dar es Salaam, the average ship waiting time dropped from 46 days to 7 days. Container traffic more than doubled. The Tanzanian government reported a jump in port-related tax revenue. DP World is also looking at ports in South Africa and Kenya. Abu Dhabi's 80 Ports Group is making similar moves. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds on the planet, has also turned its attention toward Africa, targeting mining, farming, and clean energy. The Saudi energy company Achwa Power reported that its investments in Africa had reached $7 billion by late 2024. The UAE's Masdar, a clean energy giant, has pledged to invest $2 billion in renewable energy projects across the continent by 2030. This Gulf money operates differently from Chinese loans. Gulf investors often take equity stakes, meaning they own a share of the project and earn returns over decades. They focus on projects that generate revenue, ports, toll roads, energy plants, and they tend to want efficiency and profit, which means they are often willing to spend on modern technology and better management. But the Gulf approach is not without risk. Some of these deals lack transparency. Interest rates on certain Gulf-backed loans have exceeded 8%, higher than what traditional development banks charge. And just as with Chinese lending, there are concerns about sovereignty. When a foreign company controls your biggest port for 30 years, questions arise about who really benefits. Perhaps the most surprising development in this story is happening inside Africa itself. For the first time, African governments and institutions are tapping domestic and international capital markets at meaningful scale to fund infrastructure. Green bonds are at the center of this shift. These are bonds, a way governments borrow money from investors, where the money must go toward environmentally friendly projects, things like solar power, clean water systems, or climate-resilient roads. In 2023, green bond sales in Africa grew by 125%, reaching about $1.4 billion. In early 2024, Côte d'Ivoire, a country in West Africa, sold a $1.1 billion sustainability bond on international markets. It was the first dollar-based bond from that country in years, and investors snapped it up. In Tanzania, a water utility in the city of Tanga issued the country's first ever subnational green bond in 2024. That means a local agency, not the national government, raised money from investors. The bond brought in about $21 million to expand the city's water supply, connecting 6,000 new households to clean water for the first time. Local investors, meaning Tanzanians, provided 65% of the funding. The bond was listed on both the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange and the Luxembourg Green Exchange. No government guarantee was needed. 5 more public agencies in Tanzania have already expressed interest in doing something similar. The combined financing potential could reach $153 million over 2 years, covering water systems, food security, transport, and urban development. The African Development Bank, headquartered in Abidjan, has been a quiet engine behind much of this growth. The bank has issued green bonds since 2013 and launched a broader sustainable bond program in 2023. By offering partial credit guarantees, the bank helps African governments borrow at lower interest rates and on better terms. It backed Côte d'Ivoire's sustainability bond, helped Senegal enter the sustainable loan market in 2024 with a €400 million deal, and supported similar instruments in Egypt and Benin. By 2025, about 12 African countries had either developed or were developing formal guidelines for green and sustainable bonds. The market is small compared to global volumes, but the trend matters. For the first time, African governments are finding ways to fund their own bridges and pipelines and power stations without relying entirely on loans from foreign governments. So what happens to Africa when China's Belt and Road pulls back? The answer is complicated. It is not one story. It is 3 stories happening at the same time. The first story is about a dangerous gap. Projects already underway are stalling. Countries that relied heavily on Chinese financing are now scrambling. As of mid-2024, 22 African countries were either in debt distress or at high risk of it. The infrastructure needs have not gone away. The roads still need to be paved. The power lines still need to be strung. And many of these projects sit half-finished, waiting for money that is no longer coming. The second story is about diversification. Africa's infrastructure financing is no longer a 2-player game between Chinese banks and Western institutions. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are building ports. Private investors are funding logistics corridors. Green bonds are paying for clean water. This wider pool of money is healthier in the long run. It means no single lender holds too much power, and competition among funders can push down costs and improve terms. The third story, maybe the most important one, is about self-reliance. When Tanzanian investors bought 65% of a green bond to build water pipes in Tanga, that was not paid. That was not a favor from a superpower. That was a local community investing in its own future. That model, scaled up and repeated across the continent, could reshape how Africa builds. None of this means the short-term pain is gone. The gap between what Africa needs and what it is getting remains vast, and the Chinese retreat has created real hardship for the countries most dependent on Beijing's money. But the scramble for new solutions has also forced a kind of financial creativity that did not exist 10 years ago. The unfinished railway in Kenya's Rift Valley is a reminder of what went wrong. The green bond in Tanzania is a signal of what might come next.